Hi, Ben. Thank you so much for taking the time to meet with me. It's a real honor and a privilege.
The honor's mine. Thank you, Yitz, for having me. It's going to be good.
So, Ben, you have worked as a reporter for Intellectual Property Magazine um, for a while. Can you share with me some of the challenges and opportunities you've noticed this COVID-19 situation presents to IP?
So I've been writing about IP for just over 2 years now, and I genuinely think, regardless of how long my journalistic career is going to be, this is the biggest thing that I'm probably going to ever face, regardless. And in terms of a narrowing kind of crux of something that I've been noticing is I've been paying a real attention to licensing. I'm sure the people you may have spoken to have said about the monitoring of platforms like the Open COVID Pledge and the COVID Declaration in Japan about granting licenses to companies of patents, which may help the combat COVID-19 and other COVID-19 related issues. And I think that's something that's really important, obviously, at the moment, because a lot of those licenses that have already been created anyway include sunset clauses, which state that the uh, actual license for the patent or relevant technology will lapse once the WHO declares the current pandemic over. Now, that's interesting because obviously that affects the agreement, but I think it's something that we may look forward to in the future in terms of changing to agreements. So, for example, you might see certain license agreements in 5 years' time include pandemic related clauses or other related clauses for situations that, okay, we might not have thought would occur previously, but actually they're going to be a lot more in depth than they obviously already are quite in depth. So something I was looking at was something like a climate issue, so any climate crisis content that may occur, that might take effect. And obviously we're going to learn from that, from the situation we find ourselves in now. The other licensing kind of content that I've been looking at, and it kind of encompasses it in generally, is the perceptions and misinformations related to IP, which is absolutely huge at the moment. So I've been speaking with a renowned IP attorney in the UK from the pharma industry, who recently told me that IP and patents and just the pharma industry in general is being what he considers to be unfairly branded as greedy. Now, this is sentiment that's kind of been encompassed for as long as I can remember, and probably since the dawn of pharma as an area. Um, but it was something that was probably going to come to head regardless of this pandemic. Obviously, you've got the US elections in November, which, with drug pricing, promised to be one of the big things at the top of the ticket. And coming off a pandemic, and of course, some of the biggest drug prices in history, this is something that's going to be more prevalent. And I definitely think that this kind of concept of misinformation surrounding IP and patents is going to grow when the idea of the needs of the many versus the needs of the few or the one becomes more prevalent in the public eye,
So,
especially
Ben,
if a virus is a vaccine rather comes about.
right. So, Ben, you had mentioned a lot of stuff in there. One thing you had mentioned in the beginning of that, it was regarding licensing, that there were a lot of governments licensing. Are you referring to compulsory licensing, or are you referring to licensing of intellectual property that companies are now giving manufacturers around the globe the option to go and produce their product?
It would probably be the latter, the licensing of companies. So you might see company A demand company B agree to probably a lot more stringent areas and agree of the agreement in terms of, okay, this is what happens if a pandemic occurs. In terms of compulsory licensing, I think only Israel, from what I've seen, Israel was probably the leader in that, in terms of they approached AbbVie's Coletra product, saying, we want to compulsory license this, and actually AbbVie went, okay, we're just going to waive our rights on that in this jurisdiction. That's probably the first I've seen, and they've probably kind of set a good example for the public in terms of, okay, pharma aren't evil as some people perceive them to be. This is a good move. Obviously, we can't, as an industry, can't control how these kind of companies are going to operate. So you see Gilead making a kind of a perceived misstep in terms of the designation of its remdesivir product from what was used to treat Ebola, and could now potentially treat COVID, obviously, because it wasn't considered the certain number of people with the disease. It was given an orphan designation, and people are going, okay, that's not fair. But obviously, it's kind of agreeing with the perceptions, and kind of the companies have got to obviously manage themselves to obviously, make a profit, of course, and protect their innovation, but at the same time think the wider implications of what this potential product or vaccine in some cases, could potentially help.
So Ben, would you say, like I was wondering, why haven't more countries exercised the compulsory licensing during this pandemic to help save lives, whether it was creating respirators, manufacturing, masks, or any other equipment?
A lot of developing countries are the ones that are going to look at IP rights as a kind of a different way to kind of the larger countries and the Western nations. I think it's because they put a larger emphasis on IP rights and understand the importance of protecting innovation to encourage further innovation, which is probably why you see countries like Chile and Costa Rica being the leaders in this WHO-backed patent licensing pool, which is being slowly introduced, which Costa Rica are testing at the end of May, which creates a pool of innovation technologies, patents, and all sorts for that people, member states can then obtain licenses for. And because obviously it's a developing nation in one lost for other words of Costa Rica, they're going to have more of okay, we want this to be able to everyone because it will benefit us and allow us to grow. Whereas someone like the US or the UK, okay, they're going to be a bit different and harbor a lot more in terms of protection IP rights, especially on who's in power as well. Of course, that can always affect those sorts of things depending on whether a certain premier or individual has allegiances to companies or donors. But that's a completely different discussion for another time, of course.
So regarding compulsory licensing, doesn't the innovation company get reimbursed? And like, isn't there a way, like, even though in general R&D, COVID-19 is not something that happens, it's once in 100 years, hopefully even less moving forward. But innovation companies, you're right, a big reason why people don't want to exercise compulsory licensing is because of the fact that it may damper the R&D companies from doing more research to be able to get their funds back. But why couldn't there be a little bit more reimbursement and that be a little bit more on the line?
I think that in a lot of jurisdictions, so for example, the United States is probably the best example of that reimbursement model. They have the takings clause of the Constitution, which states that if the government takes something, they have to be, from an individual entity, they have to be reimbursed. Now, that usually applies to something like if they want to build an airbase or a road from someone, they take the land and then reimburse them. They have similar things in the UK with land in terms of what they call compulsory purchase. But I definitely think that, say, if a US pharma giant makes a vaccine that works, the government may be kind of incentivized to go, okay, we'll take that from you under the takings clause. Here's a relevant fee in which would benefit everybody in terms of you get a fair remuneration. And I think in a lot of cases of compulsory licensing, in most nations that are, understand and value IP rights, fair remuneration would come about. I think you're going to see more of the vigorous compulsory kind of things occurring in more developing nations. And I think the remunerations need to occur, of course, 100%. But then I think they need to be fair as to what it is. I think the pharma companies, they're not going to make a product if they're not going to get some money for it, regardless of whether it's compulsory or otherwise. They want to obviously create something to obtain a profit, and that's absolutely fine. But I think they need to realize that this product could obviously potentially save our race and our planet. And I think they need to kind of weigh up the costs of fairness in that relation. So remuneration obviously should occur regardless, whether it's compulsory or otherwise, but it needs to be balanced fairly to how the product can help and whether it's actually cost-effective drug anyway, because they, could hike the price up and then license it out and then call for more money back.
So being part of the team at Informa, one of the largest intellectual property magazines, so how would this situation, what are the challenges and opportunities the current situation presents to you, a legal journalist who specializes in IP?
So in terms of the opportunities and challenges we kind of face it's kind of caused us to kind of reevaluate our situation at the moment. So we have journalists are very easy people. We can come out of the office, we can work anywhere. Put me on a beach, I'm fine. But that's not the case for a lot of our readers. So we have to position ourselves to be able to continue offering our product to them. That's not a problem for us. It's given us the opportunity to kind of sit and realize, okay, this is where we are. And it's given us a chance to reflect most of all, and how can we how can we create a better product for our readers? So at the moment, it's given me more time to focus on IPM's podcast behind the scenes and getting that fine tuned. We've been working on a lot of different content as well that we'd never normally dream of doing. So we're producing a lot more updates in terms of individuals in the news section of our printed product, for example. And it's kind of made us reevaluation is probably and reflection is probably the big thing. I think for me as a journalist generally, I'm in a full-time role with a salary, touching wood, and I'm fine. Again, touching wood. But there are many like me in my, not so much IP industry, but generally as a writer, and probably not limited to as journalists, that aren't safe in a role. And I have a sneaking suspicion that cost restructuring and positional restructuring across the globe in all walks of life is going to occur on a scale unseen since even 2008. Because as businesses look to adjust their budgets accordingly, but also to streamline operations in line with potential social distancing rules and parameters that may come in within the next year or two in various jurisdictions. So I think it has caused a lot of uncertainty. I hate to use that word because everyone uses it, but it's caused a lot of uncertainty across the board. And I think it's something that we kind of need to just kind of be aware of and not be kind of frightened of, but kind of just be ready for anything.
So it's really helped your team be a little innovation. It's funny because you guys are reporting on innovation and then you guys are becoming innovators. Is there anything going to be in the patent space? Are you going to patent anything?
No, sadly not. We are just looking to increase our content and continue to continue our roles. And it's funny you should say that. I've read an article from a UK newspaper that was saying that the Britons are bored, so to the point that they are trying to create inventions more and obtain patents more, which they could probably do some good from some of those inventions. I know how dangerously bored things can get when you're not working, but yeah, I think it's encouraging people to use their time effectively in this situation. So I think it's important that while we're not patenting, maybe others can.
So Ben, as a young professional in the IP field, do you feel COVID-19 is giving you a particular set of skills like that you should have gained or developed had you not been exposed to a situation like this?
I think that for someone in my age range of early 20s, being in a professional environment, this is kind of giving me the opportunity to kind of focus a bit more and come up with a way of dealing with stress. This is probably the most stressful time that any of us are ever going to face over the next 20 years. And if we can get through this, we can get through anything. I always say that everyone's worried, and if you're not worried, I feel like you're not taking this seriously. The main thing that I wanted to kind of get across about this, in terms of not just my age range, but every age range, is that we should use this situation we find ourselves in now to open up and talk more as an industry. So in the UK side of things, I think the UK is one of the biggest leaders in terms of talking about mental health in the IP industry. So, for example, you've got EIP, which is a UK-based and European law firm, and they have trained their staff some of their staff to become qualified mental health first aiders. Which is, I think, something every firm should look to do, because at the end of the day, this is probably had the biggest change on everybody's mental health, regardless of scale, of anything of the last century. And I wanted to note the work of IP Inclusive in the UK, who do a lot of stuff around inclusivity, diversity, and inclusion. Their work is exemplary, and I think they've been leading the charge for mental health for a long time. But I think that it shouldn't just be them. I think the industry needs to realize that, okay, we are all under incredible stress at the moment, and that mental health is probably going to be the biggest thing that we should look to not only address, but open up and kind of deal with as an industry, and work on kind of evaluating and coming up with ways that how we can benefit and better ourselves in that area of our lives.
So Ben, is there anything else you would like to add that reflects how IP has been impacted by the global reality that we're currently living in?
The last thing I would say is that, at the end of the day, and past the pandemic, IP is always going to be here. There's always going to be the need for everyone across the board in the industry, is still going to underpin the world that we find ourselves in. But regardless of, the end of it, we've got to be thinking of the opportunity to reflect and grow on the now, and address whatever issues that we have currently in the industry, no matter how small, rather than focusing on the what ifs and the could this occur. Let's address on the problems we currently find ourselves in while we've got this chance to reflect, because the what ifs haven't happened yet.
And if you had 30 seconds, what would you tell the young IP professionals around the world? How should they expect the patent profession moving forward?
In terms of looking ahead to how the profession might change, don't let what you read in the media affect the perception of the industry. I would say look at the person, not the overall product, and also think empathetically in terms of both the public and the individual working as well. Because while you may agree with the concept of, while you may not agree with the concept of intellectual property, or why you might not agree with certain things currently to do with the pandemic, that industry is always going to be there, and it's integral to how we function as a society. So I think they need to kind of, they would need to kind of continue with an open mind, and think this might change, but it's going to change for the better regardless.